Hi chess fans. After d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, e6, we have reached the semi-Slav position. Remember that if black plays knight f6 here, we want to play knight c3 in the main variation, and after d takes a4, bishop f5, it becomes clear why black was delaying e6, because he wanted to get the bishop out. This is one of the main ideas in the Slav variation. And so after e3, now e6, bishop takes c4, bishop b4, the game continues. Now, if black, however, in this position does not play knight f6, the Slav, but e6, the main variation continues with e3, knight f6, bishop d3, knight bd7, castles, and now only after black has moved the dark squared bishop to d6, only now white plays knight c3, and the game continues. So that is a big difference between the Slav and the semi-Slav variation, where in the Slav white plays knight c3 immediately, and in the semi-Slav white is delaying this move as long as possible. So why is that? Let's have a look. One of the main features in this position is that this bishop is now free to come to b4. And so if white plays knight c3, black has a number of interesting variations that involve taking the pawn on c4 and pinning this knight to b4, pinning this knight on c3 with bishop b4. So let's have a look at those variations. So if white does play knight c3 immediately, black can take on c4 and threatens to play b5 to protect this pawn and end up with an extra pawn. So for example, if white plays e3, b5, and now a4, white gets under a lot of pressure here. For example, black can just push the pawn forward to b4, and after knight b1, bishop a6, protect this pawn here. And if white were to attack this pawn again with, for example, knight to d2, black can even play c3, and after b takes, c takes, and the knight moves away, black is still a pawn up, and white has lost the right to castle. So in this position here, white definitely wants to play a4 to prevent b5. And the knight has an important role here, because after b5 takes, the knight can take and black ends up a pawn down, because white will also be able to capture this pawn. So in this way the knight has an important function here, and black, because he has played e6 in the semi-Slav, now has the possibility to pin this knight against the king and threaten b5 again, robbing the knight, so to speak, of its function to protect the b5 square. And this variation is called the semi-Slav Notebaum variation. And I think it's a good, this variation is a good illustration of why white wants to delay playing knight c3 in the main variation. So white wants to play e3 to try capture back this pawn. If white simply ignores the situation on the queen side and develops with g3, b5, bishop d2, black can consolidate his position with bishop b7, castles a6, and for example knight e5, knight e7. This pawn is protected, and black simply ends up with a pawn up, and white is a pawn down. So that's why white in this position wants to usually continue fighting for winning back the pawn. And black now plays b5, and white plays bishop d2, and now this knight can perform his function again of attacking the b5 pawn. So in this position here, white is again threatening a takes b, and again white can simply settle down and develop further, bishop e2, but then just end up with a pawn down again. So bishop d2 is the way of continue fighting for winning back the pawn. And now black can push the pawns on the queen side. a5, and white can play a takes b, and after bishop takes, c takes. Again, white continues the fight for winning back the pawn, b3, bishop b7, b takes, and b4. In this position here, white has effectively won back the pawn, but the price for this is a highly unbalanced position that is certainly easier for black to play. Black has these two passed pawns, and in return white has these strong pawns here and controls the center. And black cannot immediately push these pawns forward because they are still very vulnerable to attacks from both the bishop and the queen and the rook. So the position is highly unbalanced and probably equal, but I feel it's much easier to play for black. And to illustrate that, let's just have a look at a few examples. In this position here, the bishop is attacked, and if white has to retreat the bishop, and if white retreats the bishop to d2, that's already a mistake, because essentially white needs to retreat the bishop to b2 to play against the plan of e5. So if white retreats the bishop to d2, the game could continue knight f6, attacking the square here on e4, bishop d3, castle, knight bd7, rook e1, and now e5 is very strong. And the point is that after e4, takes, knight c5 is a nice square, and you can see that the formerly strong center that white had with his pawns in the center is now shattered. Both c4 and e4 are weak, and black has these ultra strong pieces attacking the weaknesses in black's camp and potentially also the white king. So that's a little bit to illustrate why e5 is such a strong plan in many positions, and that's why here white already has to pay attention to play bishop b2, which is already a little bit counterintuitive because white might be worried about these two pawns and retreat the bishop to d2 to kind of keep an eye on those pawns. So that's already an important move here, bishop to b2, and I think it illustrates why this position is more comfortable for black. White already has to find the right moves. Okay, so the game could continue knight f6, bishop d3, knight bd7, castle, and now white again has to pay attention because, white wants to push the pawn, so it might be an idea to push the e4 pawn, also because the square is eyed by enemy pieces. It makes sense to come up with the plan of pushing this pawn. So you might want to play rook e1 to push the pawn, but after rook e8, e4, again black has e5, and we have already seen that if black takes here, then he would shatter white's pawn structure. So white has to respond with something like c5, but then again black just takes, and the pawn structure is very weak. So in this position here, the plan e4 is not a good plan. White has two plans here. One is queen c2, and after queen c7, c5, pushing the pawn forward and always playing a little bit with this fork. And then after, for example, h6, e4, bishop c6, the game continues and the position remains highly unbalanced. Again, white in this position here also cannot play the e4 plan, which might look intuitive, because again e5, c5, and again the pawn structure is shattered. Another setup in this position, other than queen c2, again e4 is difficult, is a plan with knight to d2, and after queen c7 the idea is f3, and this is a very solid structure against black's setup. And if black now uses the break e5 that has been supported by the queen and the knight, in this position white can simply ignore and play king to h1, rook f8, queen c2, and the game continues, and black now always has to watch a little bit e5. So I think the knight d2 in combination with f3 plan is very good against a player who always has this e5 plan in mind. The point is that after f3, this square is very, very safe, and so it will never be a threat that black plays e4, and that allows white in turn to simply keep the structure as it is. And if black ever plays himself pawn takes, then we can take with the pawn and have a very strong two passed pawns here that are not blocked by any other pawns, and in combination with good piece play. Well, black also has good piece play, but maybe these pawns in a position like this are a little bit weaker than these pawns because they cannot be protected as well. So again, the main point of this video is that if black plays the Semi Slav, watch out for this bishop, and that's why in the main line you want to play, in the main line you want to play e3, knight f6, bishop d3, so you can play a lot of moves with white other than knight c3, and you can even castle, and only after black moves the bishop you play knight c3, and the idea is that if you play knight c3 you run into all these variations with bishop b4, like the note bomb variation. And this is especially important to keep in mind because in the Slav variation knight f6 you want to play knight c3 because this knight attacks the e4 square and you want to protect the e4 square with the knight. And only later here if black takes on c4 and you can play a4 and the bishop comes out, but this gives you enough time to recapture this pawn before the dark squared bishop arrives on b4. Thanks a lot for watching and see you next time.